the most terrifying experiment in human history, bringing a dead body back to life just so humans could defeat death. And this obsession with becoming immortal led to something unimaginable: Frankenstein. Yeah, you've probably heard of this monster. But what if I told you he wasn't actually a monster at all? In fact, he was a pure vegetarian. So what was his real origin? Where did he truly come from? Once you find out the truth, it's going to blow your mind. Today, we're uncovering the real story of Frankenstein and answering the biggest question: was Frankenstein actually real? And how did a mad scientist create something like this on a dark, stormy night with lightning tearing across the sky? Frankenstein came to life. The answer lies in an experiment that should have never been performed in human history. Even today, many people believe that an experiment like Frankenstein's must have actually happened years ago, just like the movies and cartoons they watch. But the truth is something else entirely, and it's not simple at all. It's far darker than you think. And this dark theory begins in the year 1817, the very year an experiment was conducted, an experiment that gave birth to Frankenstein. In 1818, the world witnessed for the first time a book called Frankenstein. It was written by Mary Shelley. And in this story, a scientist named Victor Frankenstein, driven by an obsession to defeat death, creates a strange, unnatural creature. But it's human hatred and rejection that slowly turns that creature into a monster. And this novel wasn't just fiction. It was inspired by reality. Frankenstein wasn't just imagination. It was a reflection of the terrifying scientific obsession of that era. If you didn't know, let me tell you, around 1818, across Europe, there were discoveries, inventions, and experiments being conducted that would send chills down your spine. This was the time known as the Age of Enlightenment, when humans began placing themselves in the position of God, challenging the very mysteries of life and death. People started believing that through certain formulas or a mysterious vital force, the dead could be brought back to life. Electricity, chemicals, and the human body. These three were being combined in bizarre experiments, all with just one goal: to achieve immortality. And during this time, in the year 1817, a German neurophilosopher, Carl August, conducted an experiment that closely mirrored the story of Frankenstein. He removed the brain of a small kitten. Yes, the kitten was already dead, and in place of its brain, he inserted two metal plates, zinc and silver, and then he delivered an electric shock. That kitten's skull turned into a living battery, and you'll be shocked to know the kitten opened its eyes. It twitched, even tried to stand for a moment, and then collapsed, dead, forever, for anyone witnessing it. This was nothing less than a nightmare. But Carl August's experiment ignited hope in people's hearts. The belief that maybe, just maybe, the dead could be brought back to life with electricity. And this wasn't the only experiment. Across Europe, another theory was also causing chaos: galvanism. The term came from the Italian scientist Luigi Galvani, who in the 1780s discovered that when electricity is applied to the leg of a dead frog, it suddenly twitches. And to an ordinary person, this experiment looked nothing less than black magic. For scientists, it was another piece of proof that maybe electricity itself is the key to life. But honestly, Luigi Galvani doesn't even sound that Italian, does it? Sounds kinda Indian. Like, could he be related to Ashish Chanchlani or Chiara Advani? Anyway, this is the kind of stuff that was going on all across Europe at the time. And all these events eventually gave birth to a story like Frankenstein, which Mary Shelley turned into her novel. But until then, no scientist had ever actually performed this kind of experiment on a human being. So how did Mary even get the idea that a human could be brought back to life using electricity? Well, behind this entire story was a man named George Foster. The reason an experiment took place that laid the real foundation for the Frankenstein legend. The year was 1817, the date, December 5th, the place, London, and the time, 4:30 in the evening. A man named George Foster was walking along a canal-side path with his wife and daughter. The next morning, a man named George Acton set out with his boat into the Paddington Canal, when suddenly he felt something collide with it. He looked closer, and was so terrified that he ran straight to the police. When authorities investigated, they discovered a body floating in the water, and that body belonged to George Foster's daughter, the same girl he had been walking with just the evening before. As the search continued, they found another body in the canal. This time, it was his wife, which meant one thing. George had taken them both to the canal and killed them. He was immediately arrested and charged with the murders of his wife and daughter. The trial was swift, and the sentence, death by hanging. However, George Foster was a somewhat influential man. Many people tried to intervene, hoping his punishment might be reduced or that he might receive some leniency, but nothing changed. And after his execution, his body was handed over to a so-called mad scientist so he could perform experiments on the corpse. Of course, I'm calling him mad today. Back then, he was actually a well-known scientist. The body was taken to a lab for scientific experimentation. On a cold night in January, renowned scientists, researchers, and journalists gathered to witness this horrifying experiment. And the man conducting it was Dr. Aldini. He connected George Foster's body to a powerful battery. Electrodes were placed on his face, and within seconds, George's jaw dropped open. A chilling silence filled the room. Suddenly, his left eye opened. His body jerked, as if he was about to sit up. Then his arms and legs started thrashing violently. The scene was so terrifying that people began running in panic. Some couldn't even stay. They fled halfway through the experiment. Now, Aldini hadn't actually brought a dead man back to life. It was just the body reacting to electric shocks. But the sight was so horrifying that one particular man, who had earlier pleaded in court for George's sentence to be reduced, was so terrified by what he saw, George's violent, lifeless movements, that he suffered a heart attack right there and died on the spot. Now, the experiment had failed, because George was never truly brought back to life. But the story spread like wildfire across Europe, and eventually it caught Mary's attention. After understanding the entire incident, she wrote a story with a central character named Frankenstein. So by now, you probably realize Frankenstein wasn't real. He was just a character in a novel. But is Frankenstein really what we've seen in movies? Was he truly a monster? Mary Shelley's Frankenstein wasn't just a horror novel. It was one of the most powerful stories of its time, raising deep questions about both science and religion. In fact, it even laid the foundation for science fiction itself. On the surface, it may seem like a story about a terrifying monster, but as you dive deeper into it, as you begin to connect with its characters, you start to realize what the creature actually went through. And that's when you begin to feel sympathy for it, and a question forms in your mind. Who was the real monster, the creature, or the man who created it? A scientist named Victor Frankenstein. Because yes, Frankenstein is not the name of the creature, it's the name of the creator. Frankenstein was the name of the scientist, the man who performed this entire experiment, the same man who abandoned his own creation, leaving that creature alone to die in a cruel world. In movies, you've seen him, a tall, bulky figure, with bolts sticking out of his neck, walking with a slow, unsteady gait, and barely speaking at all. That's the image Frankenstein became known for. But trust me, when you actually read Mary Shelley's original novel, the real description of the creature will shake you to your core. It was written to be far more terrifying. The purpose behind creating this being was simple: to bring the dead back to life. When the experiment began slipping out of the scientist's control, he abandoned the creature, leaving it alone in this world. It received no love, no acceptance, only hatred and rejection from humans, which ultimately turned it into something people feared. But in reality, Frankenstein's creature wasn't a monster at all. It was intelligent and even a vegetarian. All it ever wanted was a little love and a sense of belonging. And I'm not just saying this emotionally. It's all written in the novel itself. And since This was the very first story ever written about Frankenstein. It can be considered the true origin story. Mary's version teaches us one powerful truth: the real monster is human behavior, and Mary's own life was filled with tragedy. Her mother died right after she was born. After she got married, her children died at a young age, and even her husband drowned to death. Her life was full of loss. Mary lived in deep loneliness, and from that loneliness, this character was born, a being who also suffered from isolation. But don't worry, the video ends here, and so does the origin story of Frankenstein. And I hope you enjoyed this story, and maybe even learned something from it. If you want to explore the backstories and origin stories of villains you've been watching since childhood, then don't miss a single episode of this series. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, and if you're already subscribed, drop a comment below and let me know how you liked the video. I'll see you in the next insane episode.